So hello everybody, and thanks for coming to this first Ethics Forum seminar of 2015. My name is Liz Cooper. I work in the university's Department for Social Responsibility and Sustainability, and I'm just chairing today. We have three speakers on our panel today. Firstly, we have Rob Ellam from the University of Glasgow, who's going to speak first. And he is a professor of isotope geochemistry and also director of the Scottish University's Environmental Research Centre. Secondly, we have Michelle Brown, who's head of programmes in the university's Department for Social Responsibility and Sustainability, who's worked extensively in international development and corporate social responsibility in Asia. And lastly, we have Tim Hayward, who's sitting at the back here, who's a professor of environmental political theory here at the University of Edinburgh. So I'd like to hand over to Rob to get things going.
Let me start off by establishing my credentials. I'm in no sense an ethicist. I'm a geologist, but sometimes the kind of training that geology gives you a slightly different perspective, and particularly it gives you a perspective on the 4.5 billion years of Earth history when there were no people around. I think I'm here because a few months ago I read this headline in the Guardian where Glasgow University has decided to divest its investments in fossil fuels. And a group of us decided to write to the Guardian and point out that that wasn't the unanimous view of the university. The people who signed that letter were Paul Younger, and many of the slides I'm going to show are actually stolen from Paul's inaugural lecture in Glasgow, and that's available online on the university website. Paul's ranking chair of engineering, and that chair's named for Rankin, who invented the process that still generates about 85% of the world's electricity. Colin McInnes, another engineer in Glasgow, you know what James Watt did. And then two of my colleagues, Finn Stewart, Adrian Boyce and myself. And I just point out that Paul and Finn were members of the Scottish Government Independent Scientific Panel on Unconventional Oil and Gas that produced a report, which is again available on the web last year. Essentially, our objections to Court's policy were really threefold. Firstly, so far as we're aware, there are not alternatives to oil and to fossil fuels available at scale for heat, transport or electricity production. Secondly, we agree with the IPCC that if we're going to meet our emissions targets, we're going to have to find some way of doing carbon capture and storage. And much of the experience in CCS resides within the hydrocarbon industry. And thirdly, actually, fossil fuels get used for a lot of other things, and particularly for production of nitrate fertilizers. And most food consumed in Europe will have been fertilized with fossil fuels. To get to where I'm coming from, I need to address some of the terminology that the specialists use. And there are kind of two types of electricity. The bare minimum that we need to operate, so the amount of electricity we use during the night, is referred to as baseload. And then our ability to respond to surges in demand is referred to as dispatchable capability. And this is how the UK does it currently. It's a little bit more complicated than the previous diagram because pump storage hydro actually uses cheap baseload during the night to pump water back up into the reservoirs to generate energy at times of peak demand. But at the moment, baseload is pretty well nuclear and gas, and our dispatchable is pretty well generated from coal. Other sources are really relatively almost minimal. Nicola Sturgeon doesn't want to do this one. Fergus Ewing, as of last week, doesn't want to do this one. Nobody wants to do this one. We've got a problem. Paul talks about this as being the energy trilemma. That we all want our energy to be three things. Of course we want it to be low carbon. We want it to be secure, and by secure I mean reliable. We don't want to be reliant on sources that we can't guarantee. If you want to know what it's like, to rely on President Putin for gas, talk to a Ukrainian or a Georgian. And we want it to be cheap. And the trouble is, there's nothing that really satisfies all three. Because you look at this diagram, there's almost a perfect inverse correlation between the amount of power generation methods generate and their carbon emissions. There is one notable exception. Nuclear is very power dense, but actually it's quite green so far as CO2 is concerned. Of course, there are other issues with nuclear power. Ironically, when I read The Guardian online, I was actually in this part of the world. I was in Fukushima Prefecture, actually Fukushima City, which is actually about 200 miles away from this place, which is the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, where reactor 1, 2, 3 and 4 all exploded in the aftermath of an enormous earthquake and attendant tsunami. It's not often talked about, but actually reactors 5 and 6 were shut down safely. But if you think that is a disaster, look at that. Now, I don't do my climate science in the pages of the Sunday Times magazine, but I think they're interesting images. This is based on a book that I'm sure many of you have read, which explores the implications of climate change and global warming up to 6 degrees centigrade. And I don't like this diagram because it has, for this Yorkshireman, it has a rather unwelcome prospect of removing God's own county, but really leaving Lancashire behind. But look at what it does on a global scale. This is catastrophic. And so I'm not here to be a climate change denier. I am here to point out that we've got a problem, and it's a real problem because just imagine what happens when millions and billions of Chinese have to migrate northwards to find somewhere that's actually inhabitable. And of course, even that's not a solution because in this world you could live at the poles, but you couldn't grow crops at the poles because it's dark for 6 months a year. This is the measure of the problem. This is from the last but one IPCC report. It shows the relationship between temperature and carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere. There's arguments about whether that's a cause or effect. I would argue it doesn't necessarily matter whether it's cause or effect. The point is that we've oscillated in climate from these high points, which we call interglacials, to ice ages or glacials, and that has oscillated over the last at least 400,000 years. The point is the difference in atmospheric CO2 between a glacial and an interglacial is about 100 parts per million, 0.01%. It's tiny, but it has a big effect. And what we've done, right at this high point, we've decided to stick another 100 parts per million of CO2, in fact more, because we're now well over 400 ppm, into the atmosphere. So right at exactly the wrong time in the climate cycle, we've added another, let's call it an ice age worth of carbon dioxide. This is not unprecedented. It's probably unprecedented that it's been done so quickly. But there were times in the geological past where the atmospheric CO2 has been as high as 2,000 parts per billion. This is, I think, called the Eocene-Paleocene thermal maximum. And it did for little organisms that live in the sea called benthic foraminifera, much as the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction did for the dinosaurs. Funnily enough, a lot of mammal species actually did quite well out of this and diversified quite successfully. So my thesis here is that I think we have to think very carefully about what is socially responsible. And sure, saving the planet is socially responsible, though I would argue that most people, when they talk about saving the planet, are actually talking about saving the people. And for a geologist, that's less of a priority. And you can take me to task for that. I've been roundly slagged off for having that opinion more than once. But my social responsibility also involves keeping people warm, fed, and with light. And it involves reducing fuel poverty. And fuel poverty is defined as when a household needs to use more than 10% of its income to keep itself warm. And at the moment, nearly a quarter of people in Britain are in fuel poverty. And it's going to get worse. I also think it's socially irresponsible to prevent the development of other parts of the world. You could argue, and we can argue about this, but it has been argued that burning coal in China has taken 650 million people out of poverty. It's also coincided with a reduction in female illiteracy of about 80% and a decrease in infant mortality of about 70%. And then the final thing is, I think it's socially responsible to try to maintain a secure supply of energy, because 82% of households in Britain rely on gas for their heating. And those that don't are more likely to be in fuel poverty, because oil and electricity are more expensive forms of heating. So the question we posed is the oil and gas sector socially responsible? A lot of capitalism is socially responsible. What I would say is you can rest assured that there are claims being made by green organisations that are also patently ill-informed. Not an opinion that's even popular in my own household. So, you know, don't feel shy to take me to task for that. This is what I think we could do, and you know, other people smarter than me could come up with more options perhaps. But we could do nothing, and lots of people are going to starve, and habitable areas will disappear. Human population will decline, and probably many species will become extinct. Although we're doing a good job of that without climate change anyway. The Earth would survive. The Earth's been there before, but it might not support life. And for 4 billion years, it only supported very simple forms of life. Actually, Venus already did this experiment. Venus was a runaway greenhouse, and Venus. If you look up tonight at dusk, you'll see the moon, and the next thing you see is probably going to be Venus. It's a beautiful planet, but you wouldn't want to live there. You wouldn't be able to live there. Its atmosphere is made of hydrogen sulfide, and its surface temperature is 450 degrees centigrade. We could change behaviour. I think that is laudable. I think we are. You know, I drive a car that now does 70 miles to a gallon. That's better than the one I changed it for, which was about half that. But I think the reality of this is more of the world is living like we do. I went to China a couple of years ago with visions in my head of a country that were 30 years out of date. Everybody doesn't ride a bike in China. Everybody's got a BMW. I like this throwaway line because I don't think they did it on purpose, but actually the dinosaurs were far better custodians of this planet than we've been, and for an awful lot longer. They were around for hundreds of million years. We've been around for about a million. My personal feeling is the way out of this is that we've got to engineer solutions. We've got to use exactly the same ingenuity that got us into this situation to get us out again. And there are options, and carbon capture and storage is one option. And personally, I think that nuclear power based on the thorium cycle rather than the uranium cycle is also a serious option. We're not really spending anywhere near enough money on any of these. Britain's not doing any thorium cycle, the Scandinavians are. We're doing a bit of carbon capture and storage. The problem is, CCS, it's the oil and gas sector that's got the expertise. They already do it. They do it to get more oil out of the ground, but they already know what they're doing. The nuclear sector is problematic because all the nuclear generation as opposed to decommissioning in this country is now being done by EDF Energy, a subsidiary of a French-owned monopoly. So, has oil and gas divestment damaged my academic freedom? Well, certainly there were people who were not prepared to sign the letter that 5 of us signed. And it's pretty notable that of those who did, all the people who've got as far as they're going to go, they were all professors. 3 of them came from my institution, which is a research unit that has no University of Glasgow core funding. We're operated under a memorandum of understanding between Universities of Glasgow and Edinburgh, but we're entirely self-contained financially. And the other 2 are actually relatively recent recruits to Glasgow. For a while, it looked like our involvement in one large award and a doctoral training programme looked threatened, but the signatories to the letter actually forced the Secretary of Court to make a clarification, which seems to have alleviated the threat. My real point here, and I know these discussions are going on in this university, is that Glasgow University could have divested in oil and gas without the attendant publicity. It didn't have to cause a splash on the pages of The Guardian. Nobody would know otherwise. Which is why I believe we have to consider the University of Glasgow's motivation to do it in such a public way to be tendacious. I think it was, and I was talking to my daughter when I was in Fukushima, and lashing out a bit about this, and she turned around and said, "Dad, Glasgow Herald and the Scottish News think this is fantastic." And so I think Glasgow University thought he got a lot of good publicity. But I think, really, it's really important that universities don't oversimplify ethical issues the way that politicians certainly do and journalists possibly do. Secretary of Court told us that the court would never revisit this decision. I'm pleased to say, actually, Court is going to be reviewing its position next week. And meanwhile, we, the College of Science and Engineering, have elected my colleague Paul Younger, one of the signatories to the letter, onto Court. So it will be a robust discussion. Something else has happened meanwhile, and Court has a responsibility to make decisions and take the financial consequences of those decisions. After recent weeks, it is now a lot more financially questionable whether it makes sense in purely financial terms to divest those investments at the current time. And I think, yeah, that's me.
To Michelle Brown.
So my name's Michelle Brown, and I work in the Department for Social Responsibility and Sustainability as the head of programs. So we are situated within the corporate services group of the university. We work with other departments across the university on issues related to social responsibility and sustainability. Now I put up a big disclaimer here. I just want to say that the views in the presentation are my own views. They do not represent those of the department or those of the university. But I was really excited to have the opportunity to join all of you today, because what I particularly like about the Ethics Forum is that we're able to throw up questions and have the opportunity to debate and to discuss and look at some of these questions. So a big thanks to Rob for joining us for this debate. And I kind of went back to the original question of the presentation, so I'm not going to focus on any particular issue, but I thought I might go back to the question, does social responsibility mean limiting academic freedom? And take a look at that. So I threw up here on the slide, I apologize for the size of the text, but as you can see, it's not always easy for people to define what it is we mean when we're talking about social responsibility. So I've thrown up a couple of definitions here. Over on the side, although we couldn't find the link for this comes from the NUS, so short and concise and good. By social responsibility, we refer to the duty that institutions have towards society in relation to ethics, well-being, social justice, global citizenship, and they put in the context of moral responsibility, which we might be able to talk about. As Liz mentioned, my background is working in international development overseas. I spent about 20 years of my life working in Asia, in China and Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and more recently Hong Kong before moving to the UK. A few years ago, ISO, who produce a lot of standards and guidance, grappled with the definition of social responsibility. So they brought stakeholders from around the world together, included academics, it included corporate participants, it included NGOs, it included labor unions, many, many different types of stakeholders, to say, well, what is social responsibility? And I put on the right here the definition that ISO 26000 talks about when they talk about social responsibility, about the responsibility of an organization for its impacts on society and the environment through transparent and ethical behavior. Ultimately, it's about contributing to sustainable development, taking into account expectations of stakeholders in compliance with the law, but also international norms of behavior, and is integrated throughout the organization. So I put up this schematic here and give it to ISO to make things complicated, perhaps. But I thought it's a useful starting point, or it sometimes is for me when we're thinking about questions and grappling with questions. I've been with the university for 1 year now, so I'm not here to talk a lot about academic freedom. In my past, I've been a researcher, but more particularly a practitioner, and my interest is working with organizations, and I believe my duty is to work with the university on social responsibility and sustainability. But we can think about what sort of topics, when all these stakeholders from around the world said, what is social responsibility? And up here in clause 6, those are the topics that were covered. Organizational governance being a heart of it. We can't be socially responsible unless we're governed well. But topics, of course, around the environment, and within that issues around climate change, around biodiversity, around pollution prevention, issues of human rights, issues of labor practices, around fair operating practices, around consumer issues, and around community involvement and development. So you might say, but we are a university. Our mission is actually the curation and the dissemination of knowledge, and we are about research, about learning and teaching. So maybe this does, or maybe this doesn't apply. But interesting enough, there's been a project over the last year with some universities around the world taking a look back at this and saying, what does social responsibility mean from a university perspective? I turn back to our own university. In 2010, the university set out its social responsibility and sustainability strategy. Recognizing that the terms are contested, social responsibility and sustainability referred to the university's contribution to understanding and addressing social, environmental and economic global challenges. So no easy task, and quite broad. Over the last year, colleagues in our department were involved with taking a look and refreshing the SRS strategy. And this definition was thrown up on the SRS department's blog So you can take a look at that too, and I put that out there in terms of looking, well, what does the definition mean? And obviously recognizing that issues around social responsibility and sustainability might be contested, those ideas in there around taking account for the effect of our activities on wider society, on staff and students, recognizing our actions can be both for good or for bad, taking account of these in planning and decision making. So I'd encourage you, as part of this debate as well, to engage with that conversation on the blog. So what I wanted to say was if, and this is an if we recognize that social responsibility takes into account many of those topics, takes into account issues of the environment, takes into account respect for human rights, takes into account issues of good governance, of accountability and transparency, well then already social responsibility has and can, to some degree, has limited academic freedom, if you're asking me for a specific answer to the question. And one example where I see this is our university's dignity and respect policy. So first and foremost, recognizing the core mission of the university is the advancement and dissemination of knowledge, and our activities are teaching, research, and support for learning. But these purposes cannot be achieved only in conditions which permit these purposes can be achieved only in conditions which permit freedom of thought and expression within a framework of respect for the rights of other people. So recognizing that those issues, that first and foremost recognizing our mission as a university, but how that can come into play. And we see that in other examples of university policy. And the Code of Practice for supervisors and research students recognizes the health and safety policy. We see that in other policy examples of the university. But these issues are not static. They will change over time. I look at things from my parents' generation and think actions that might have happened were very socially irresponsible. My children already are pointing at me and saying actions that I take are socially irresponsible. So what we define as socially responsible will change over time and will change in different contexts, which might apply. So I thought I'd throw that out there. I haven't addressed any specific social responsibility issues, but really looking forward to the question and answers and debates as well.
Well, I'll hand over to Tim Hayward.
I don't have slides, and I'm going to be fairly brief. I'm just going to do what I often encourage students to do, and just answer the question. And does social responsibility mean limiting academic freedom? My answer is no. But I will say just a few more words on the subject, because an answer like that is never quite as simple as it sounds. And the first thing to reflect on is why the question even arises. Because if you think about it, the academic pursuit of knowledge is a good thing for society. That's why societies have universities. And the pursuit of knowledge can produce many benefits, and often these benefits are unforeseen. So the most effective way of engaging this pursuit, which is socially valuable, is to allow the full freedom to explore the world and our ideas about it. So to be socially responsible, far from limiting academic freedom, seems to be positively required to ensure it. But in the context that we're here today, social responsibility is a department in the university. It's about actually doing things, not simply getting ideas about things. It can be used sometimes to suggest that some social goals should take precedence over others, and then hard decisions get taken. And a concern I would have within the university is if you translate a particular idea of social responsibility into particular policy ideas, such that some particular goals, for example, should even be embedded in the curriculum. You sometimes hear this suggested, or that these goals should be used to direct research agendas. Here I think we have to be a bit more cautious in welcoming it, because by virtue of these activities, academic freedom can be impinged on. So I think the university should be very careful about implementing these things within its own core activities, which are pursuing knowledge. So any attempt to direct academic work by reference to these goals of social responsibility should, if it's going to be attempted at all, minimally ensure that these goals are subject to the utmost scrutiny, rigorous scrutiny, and with a really wide breadth of perspective, taking account of all the kinds of things we've heard in the speeches today. And I think in this academic freedom is particularly important. So I would say that the first rule of social responsibility for the university ought to be to make the fullest use of academic freedom to work out what social responsibility means. You can get as many academics and stakeholders from around the world as you want to discuss the debate and realise that it's intensely contested and very complex and involves very, very many different things. As somebody who works with these concepts as my day job, I'm very aware that any definition is going to be liable to many interpretations. Each of those interpretations is going to have sub-definitions and sub-interpretations, and you can go round and round. At the end of the day, you're going to have to come back to try to assess things in the simplest and core terms that you possibly can. So, and the way to preserve this, actually, I think, is by encouraging academic freedom, so these things are heard, and a consensus can emerge about what is appropriate for the institution. But the institution is always actively reflecting. The idea that the institution is willing to hold itself accountable is really the cornerstone of being socially responsible. Because, as Michelle said, I mean, we might think we're right one day, but the next day it turns out we're wrong about our views of what's actually socially responsible. But if we're always open to correction, always open to reflection, then we are in good faith being as socially responsible as we can at any given point in time. And I think that is what it makes sense to aspire to. Now, I'm suggesting then that you can have a kind of socially irresponsible social responsibility which would conflict with academic freedom. If you try to get people to do things because of some partially thought out policy. But I think it's also worth reflecting on academic freedom. And I just want to make a few distinctions because, and this will relate indirectly to some of the things that the first speaker, Rob was talking about. When we think about academic freedom, I think one distinction to draw is between the ends and the means. There are already well-established ethical principles governing the means by which people can engage with research. There is a Research Ethics Committee which has to do with the methods, making sure people are not hurting other people or other creatures, and that they're not breaking the law or in any other kinds of ways doing things that are bad. But these rules pretty much exclusively pertain to the methods of research. They don't pertain to the goals or the ends of the research. And I think, in keeping with my defence of academic freedom, I think this is entirely appropriate. That the ends of academic research should be freely chosen by academics. And it's on this point that I've just made one more basic distinction, because having distinguished means from ends, I would also want to distinguish two kinds of ends. There's the end of research, which I referred to at the beginning, which is about allowing open-ended inquiry to find out about the world, to explore it, to follow its logic, follow the evidence, and to discover things. That is the end which society considers valuable and which universities as institutions are here to provide. So that's what I would call its intrinsic end. Another kind of end would be extrinsic or instrumental. This would be an end of research whereby somebody out in the world, perhaps a stakeholder, says, I have this particular problem I'd like you to solve. Can you figure out how we're going to do this? Can you perhaps work out the basic science that will make it possible? I'm really interested in you being able to do this. Now this end is one which is not intrinsic to the academic freedom argument. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I'm saying it comes under a different category. If a university took a decision that a particular objective of a third-party funder, for example, wasn't one that it particularly thought was socially responsible, it would have no particular responsibility to support research in that field. So I don't think academic freedom would be contravened if a university chose not to explore certain kinds of avenues. For that reason, because those are extrinsic, not intrinsic. The defence of academic freedom doesn't cover everything that everybody outside the university might want it to. So really, I'm just making these comments in order to offer some framing for the various debates that we might be having in the next period of this session. One last thing, given that Rob here has been talking about the wider context and the issues associated with climate change and the divestment decision in particular, I think the view that I would just mention here now is that how a university invests money when it's not investing it directly in its core activities is a matter that the university can decide according to a number of criteria. But what I would say is when it's doing that, it's not in any way engaging in activities of academic freedom or otherwise. It's neither impinging nor supporting, it's just investing money. And so I see a fairly clear distinction between issues of academic freedom and issues involved in divestment decisions. And I think those things can be linked, obviously. I'm interested to hear more about the threats that you mentioned earlier. These things can be linked when research is on behalf of other kind of interests in society. But I think if we're going to discuss these connections, then we need to see each of the steps. Because we know that the Glasgow decision did not mean the lights suddenly went out in Glasgow or anywhere else. So we need to be realistic about the actual context of what the aims of the divestment campaign were, what the reasoning of the university was, and how to respond to it. I will leave my thoughts at that. I look forward to discussing further with everyone else.
Thank you. I'd now like to ask all the speakers to come up to the front with the chair, and we will open up the discussion to everyone else. So do we have a first comment or question?
I'm Brian Martin. I'm a retired Edinburgh academic, and I've been working on social responsibility, university social responsibility for the last couple of years since I retired, in the context of an EU-funded project. One of the things we've done is try to take ISO 26000 and develop from it a set of benchmark standards for university social responsibility across the European higher education area. After much delay, the report from this project is about to be published, I think, but I've been saying that for about 4 months now. We're still struggling a little bit with one or two of the things. But if I could, from the perspective of that work, ask Tim a question. Tim, I recognise some of what you said from the 2 or 3 blogs that you've done recently on social responsibility at universities. In those, if I'm reading it correctly, you distinguish between academic activities and other responsibilities, and you distinguish between core business and a social role. Is it really possible to conceive of academic activities within the higher education sector in the early 21st century, given the dependence on public funding, as separate from having a social role from the university's wide-ranging social responsibilities?
Well, I see academic activity as itself a social role, but I see that as a distinct role from checking the energy efficiency of the estate, for example. So, the core business though, of the institution is to generate and curate and disseminate knowledge. And that is understood as a social role. What we do in the academic departments is different from what goes on in some of the other departments at the university, which is to do with maintaining its infrastructure, maintaining its logistics. And it's important that in all of those functions it's socially responsible. My starting point really was that as an academic, if you're doing your job properly, you're sort of almost by definition being socially responsible if you're doing it conscientiously.
Yeah, I agree with you, totally. But it's just in your blog, what you seem to imply is that academic activities are, or can be, separate from the social role of the institution. That you distinguish between core business and other responsibilities. And I think that's slightly confusing and somewhat unhelpful. If you truly believe that you can't engage in academic activity without in some way or other being socially responsible.
I think if we've agreed this afternoon, then I'd have to review what I said in the blog to make sure that I've not said anything I disagree with in that.
Well, we'll take that on.
But I think for me, something that I'm noticing from both the divestment case and also a conversation that came up recently in the university's Fair Trade Steering Group about the fact that our catering outlets have signed up to a thing called Food for Life, which is a scheme of the Soil Association, who are obviously very pro-organic, and at the same time we've got all sorts of research into GM. So it's not that those decisions by sort of the operations side of the university are not limiting the academic freedom to research on these areas, but does it matter that we appear as an institution to be perhaps being hypocritical? Or just all of these sort of contradictions? Any thoughts?
Well, and I think being hypocritical is hard to avoid in the circumstances that Rob set out. I mean, we depend on things we don't want to depend on. And we can't suddenly stop depending on them, so as long as we depend on them, we can do. And if we want to also say we need to change this as quickly as we can and do various things to try and make that happen, then anyone can come along and say you're being hypocritical because your campaign is using all kinds of infrastructure supported by coal. But that's the point would be that that's not the choice. You prefer to get to a situation where you change that. I mean, I would see that the fact that we depend so much on coal is not something that we simply have to live with. It's actually a problem which we have to try and figure out how to address. And if you get called a hypocrite, then I think, take it. I mean, I used to be a smoker, and I used to be very approving of rules preventing me from smoking in various places, because it helped me to actually not smoke in those places and smoke a bit less. I mean, was I a hypocrite in wanting anti-smoking rules when I was a smoker? I'm not a smoker now. I mean, the long term, it kind of worked out. If I have one of my blogs. I said the fossil fuel divestment. It's not if, it's not whether, it's when. And the question is when. And the scary stuff we're seeing, we should be thinking about doing it sooner rather than later, if we really want to start trying to shift what's accepted more widely.
Do we have any further questions, comments? Yes?
One point and one question more directed to Robert. So the first thing is actually away from this question, but to do with your presentation. When you're identifying the expertise for the CCS being in the oil and gas sector, and there not being ready alternatives that give us the capacity for our heat and power requirements. To me it's quite straightforward. I'm not involved heavily in these divestment campaigns, but I kind of see that as being the actual point. If you take that investment out of oil and gas and put it in to the places that you're saying don't yet have the capacity, then you might be able to generate that capacity. And the same applies to the CCS. It's not saying let's not do CCS, it's saying let's use CCS, but don't let the oil and gas sector kind of get another monopoly now on the solutions to the problems that they generated. So that's one point to the side, and I'll let you.
I don't disagree with you at all. I'm not. Entirely correct. We do need to look for different ways, and it is. I've been interested in UK energy policy, world energy policy, since I was doing geography at high school, and that's a long, long time ago. And it's been a basket case throughout. Certainly UK policy has. But I've always thought there were far more important things to do with oil than burn it. And so I don't in any way disagree. It's just what my point is really. We do need to keep things going, and we're not in a position to stop using fossil fuels yet now. And some of the alternatives are even less popular than fossil fuels.
Yeah, thanks. And then the question then would be, with your own work, do you? Maybe I wasn't sure. Were you saying that because of the University of Glasgow's decision to divest from fossil fuels, that affected your ability to? That affected your freedom as an academic?
I should have clarified at the beginning. I meant to, and I didn't say it. But I I don't have a lot of involvement with the oil and gas sector. I've taken money off them to do measurements for them occasionally, but a few thousands of pounds over my career. Except that last year, the University of Glasgow loaned me £1.2 million to go down a new research area on the back of a business case that was heavily predicated on the assumption that I would attract funding from the oil and gas industry. And the same university court that made that divestment decision made an investment decision to lend me £1.2 million on the basis that I'd get it back from the oil industry. So what really got me seething, sat in my hotel room in Fukushima, was that hypocrisy. The other hypocrisy that I would mention is the University of Glasgow, in its drafty medieval mock Gothic building, just installed a gas central heating system.
Any further?
The further clarification is I have been encouraging colleagues to seek funding from the particularly petroleum industry as a pragmatic response to the collapse in funding that we've seen from government. But governments do pretty socially irresponsible things, and yet we happily take funding from research councils.
One of the things that I think is healthy about the current situation in the debate about social responsibility and the university sector, is the way in which it promotes the interrogation of policy and practice. So, for example, the current campaign on socially responsible investment at the University of Edinburgh was something that wouldn't have happened, I think, certainly not as quickly as it has, were it not for USA's pressure on that front. And yet, it's not always easy to hold the university to account for some of the decisions and pronouncements that it makes. So another area of activity which was actually mentioned in a response to your first blog tip by Karen Bowman, the Director of Procurement at this university, is that the university has signed up to the Workers' Rights Consortium. And that's laudable. The Workers' Rights Consortium is primarily focused on improving working conditions in countries where wages are low and sweatshops are common. And one of the things within the WRC principles is that workers will not be paid less than 1.5 times for any overtime that they work. And yet, when I, in a union's context, was trying to hold the university to account for that in respect of our own manual staff, who are not paid 1.5 times for any overtime that they work across the board, the university said, well, that's something different. No, the debate goes on about that. But when the university makes these pronouncements, produces these policies, states these commitments, underlines these values and principles, it becomes much easier to have the debate. It becomes much easier to raise the issue. And I think that the more that social responsibility is teased out in policy and practice, the better it will be for raising these issues and pursuing goals, including the wider goals of social justice.
I would just echo that comment, I think, in a reflection back to that social responsibility doesn't stop at the doorstep for the university. It's connected to how we engage with other people, whether it's in our supply chain through things like fair trade or the Workers' Rights Consortium, and also, of course, touches on the question of where our money is invested. So it is I recognise that it's been slow and I'm not closely involved with the discussion that is happening, but that the university is taking that conversation seriously in terms of looking at the different viewpoints and coming up with an answer to that question. And it's that's inspiring to be a part of an organisation which does look seriously at those questions across all of the areas where it might have impacts. But picking up on Tim's comment earlier, separating the ends from the means, and is that an appropriate way to frame it? I thought that was quite interesting.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, just a wee thought I was having to pick up on what Robert said quite at the beginning of the talk about the core role of the university in line with generating knowledge. But I think actually nowadays the role of universities has changed so much and so drastically, and universities are increasingly being run like businesses. And I ask myself more and more often, shouldn't the universities be held then accountable in the same way as businesses are being held accountable nowadays? That's just a question I've had in my head for a long time, actually. And then to pick up on that wee issue of funding, resources, and renewable energy, and how to allocate funding and how to use it, is that interestingly, there's actually a correlation in Germany between how much funding goes into renewable energy and researching renewable energy, and the public opinion about how good or useful or important renewable energies are or can be. So there seems to be a correlation between how much money goes in and what the public thinks of that. And then I think maybe we should be thinking about the role of universities and the role of researchers as in sending out actually sending out a message to the rest of the world, or generating ideas within the public about what might be important or what might be not important. Because when the public constantly has the idea of, renewable energy, we can't substitute our base load with that, this is never going to work, it's never going to happen, they will never vote for politicians and parties who might actually get things going and to get us there faster, because we all agree, I think, that it's no one argues that something needs to happen, and also no one argues that we are not there yet. So something needs to be done, but we're never going to get there when the public keeps believing that nothing can be achieved anyway. So I think there's a responsibility for the university and for the researcher to send these, or to at least be aware of the kind of signals that funding and taking funding and using funding for the research sends out.
Two things there. I agree. I'm not sure I should say this, but when you become a professor in the University of Glasgow, you have to sign an oath that you've been loyal to the university. But I believe my academic freedom is far more compromised by the corporate governance of the University of Glasgow than it is by divestment in oil and gas. And I talk to colleagues who tell me that university management are no different elsewhere. But I wasn't trying to say that we could never be different. We're represented as the way we are. I think you mentioned Germany. I think that's a very interesting case. That after Fukushima Daiichi, Germany turned off its nuclear power stations. It's now heavily reliant on Putin.
Yeah, but we turned off the nuclear power stations after 8 years of a conservative government, where during these 8 years, less and less funding went into renewable energies.
Right.
So that's a classic Merkel U-turn.
Well, that's why I say the UK energy policy has been a basket case all my life. I lost my first Sunday job because there was a revolution in Iran and Britain ran out of petrol. I was days when you didn't fill your own car with petrol. And I've been a bit bitter about UK energy policy ever since. the trick is to come up with something renewable that can deliver that base load. But we're a long way away from that, but I'm not saying we won't get there. And thorium nuclear is a lot safer than uranium nuclear and generates a lot less waste. Just can't do it yet.
I think what we're seeing is, I mean, for me, I can't see how any university policies or strategies on social responsibility and sustainability are doing anything more than sort of nudging and encouraging sort of ideas that people might be interested in researching. I can't see at the moment how they would be limiting any more than, say, the impact agenda is, and just the sort of the fact that you have to, you know, really explain why you're doing your research and what the benefits are and for whom. So unless anyone would like to disagree with me on this. For me, I can't see the risk of what we're doing in our department and sort of higher level strategies at the moment really limiting academic freedom, but just sort of creating more debate and more discussion around, are we contradicting ourselves? So, yeah.
I guess I might consider it, I guess I'd maybe disagree with that. If an organisation is going to act socially responsibly, just as an organisation might comply with laws or any other set of rules or guidelines or anything like that, can that be anything other than an impingement on academic freedom? Because absolute academic freedom, without being able to say break the law, would not be possible. So, you know, if you were able to do anything you wanted to, then it would be possible to be even more academically free than it's possible to be under the law. So any set of rules or guidance must be an infringement on academic freedom. But is that necessarily a bad thing? It'd be interesting what the panel think of that.
Well, one of the things about academic work, of course, is that academics will always find ways to get around the rules or around the regulations. The closest I've come to a real dilemma about my teaching in the course of a 40-plus year career in higher education was when I did some teaching for our business school on their MBA program. My own discipline base is education. Much of the last half of my career, my specialist area was education planning and administration. So I used to teach strategy. So when the business school found itself short of teachers of strategy, I was drafted in to teach a course. And I found that the way in which the course was being taught and the principles at the centre of the course were totally at odds with my own position on teaching strategy. Firstly, there was a textbook, and that textbook was predicated on the notion that economic growth is a fundamentally wonderful thing, and you know, must be pursued at all costs. And the best way to achieve economic growth is through hyper-competition, and you know, competitive markets reign. And firstly, I never used a textbook because in my teaching I tried to encourage students to read widely and to adopt a variety of perspectives from different sources. I didn't find any textbook ever that sort of encapsulated that for me. And secondly, the models and premises that you know, this set book was promoting, the very models and premises that got us into the economic mess attached to the crash of 2008. So, you know, did I exercise my academic freedom to teach in my way and according to the principles and values that were at the core of that? Yes, I tried to. And the class virtually walked out in the third week because I wasn't going through the textbook chapter by chapter, and therefore they couldn't work out what was going to be in the exam. We agreed to differ, and it was an unhappy term, and my worst ever ratings for my teaching. There was a story about the ways in which academic freedom is always prescribed in some form or other, and the difficulty in some contexts of teaching in a socially responsible fashion. Look at the post-crash economic society, economics, education and learning report that was republished in 2014. It's writ large there.
Yeah, I think we've been talking more about academic freedom in terms of research, but it's interesting to bring in teaching. I think it's more immediate to see whether we should be allowing people to just teach whatever they want and have that complete freedom when we have certain sort of values as an institution. So does anyone have any comments on sort of teaching and academic freedom?
I think there's case studies from around the world. I'm originally from Toronto, and I think York University in Toronto came into a challenge, was it about last year, when there were requests to separate the men and the women in the class, and students had asked for some of the group work to be separated, that there were people who only wanted to work with men in groups or only wanted to work with women in groups, and I don't know what the answer was, but you can imagine the debate around there, because actually this wasn't a business school, and industry was saying we need people to come out of the MBA program able to work with men and women, and does that go against the values of dignity and respect and equality and diversity for a university to segregate men and women? So there could be an example. I don't know if Tim, you would have more.
I would just say there's more things to take into account when you think about the teaching, because there is kind of research element there, and any learning involves research on the part of the student. But the structuring of that learning has to be something that's agreed reasonably by people that are responsible for it. So I think the issues there are more complex, so I don't say that. I think the basic principle would still apply there, but in a more complex way.
I think, especially from a teaching point of view, certainly what was said just now, and from my own experiences, the biggest limit to academic freedom is actually the university's own regulations and parameter, and not anything that comes from a social responsibility background. I think I'm interested. I would be interested what others do.
Do you mean in terms of disciplines, or what kind
No,
of?
the university is very often not just self-limiting, but limiting our academic freedom when it comes to teaching and research. Not just, not just a sense of social responsibility and sustainability that we impose ourselves, but there are already pre-prescribed regulations in which we have to move. That I perceive as a much bigger limit.
I think I would make a point in terms of the university as a public body, and therefore has to oblige by certain directives from the government. Look at health and safety, for example, climate change. And what role do you see the government in terms of limiting academic freedom? Do you think it's already doing that with legislation, or do you think it actually encourages the academic freedom?
Look at me. I think the university needs to be socially responsible and how it responds to any kind of demands and pressure. The government's slightly interesting because in a sense it's a third party, in another sense it is part of society. And governments sometimes act more like the socially responsible agents, and other times more like a third party. I can't particularly think offhand of any specific issues that I'd have to come to a decision on here. But clearly the governments have a potential to threaten academic freedom, and clearly you can identify things where you can say this is what has been happening, unintentionally or not. And I think one of the many reasons I welcome the social responsibility movement within this university is that it enables us to talk about all of these things. And I think that's possibly something we should be talking about in future occasions, is actually social responsibility, academic freedom, and the role of government, and how it all stitches up. Because yes, we are funded to a large extent by the government, so we are trying to do the same thing as the government in a way, which is bring good things for society. But that doesn't mean that there's all kinds of tensions and difficulties in the workings of these relationships, as well as beneficial ones as well.
In the benchmark standards for university social responsibility across the European higher education area, the one that I think, or the criterion, because there are 4 standards, is the standard of environmental and societal responsibility, which includes all the sustainability stuff. There's one on fair practices, which takes the ISO 26000 but extends it in a number of ways. There's one on governance, which I agree with Michelle is absolutely central. And there's one on, and this is a leading one, social responsibility in teaching, research, support for learning and public engagement. And one of the criteria, there are 42 criteria across this first standard, one of the criteria within that research, teaching, support for learning and public engagement standard is that public funds granted to a university in support of teaching and student fees will be used for the purpose for which they are given. In other words, that funds to support teaching and student fees will not be used to cross-subsidise research. And I can see that one as being particularly problematic in a university like this. But equally, I think it's socially irresponsible for a university to take a grant to help fund teaching and to take student fees without devoting those funds to the purpose for which they were given.
Pick up on your point, I'm increasingly concerned. When the research councils were set up, there was a thing called the Haldane principle, which suggested that government shouldn't interfere in the workings of the research councils. My belief is that government, particularly BIS, is very much guiding funding decisions made by the research councils now.
Would anyone else like to say anything? Any further thoughts from the panel?
Just picking up
Yeah.
on that comment, and on Tim's point, it looks like we might have a topic for a next ethics forum as well too.
The thing that occurred to me is we already filter academic freedom.
Yeah.
There are certain subjects that we wouldn't go anywhere near, and so and I think one of you had a point about that. Part of academic freedom is not offending other people, or is it?
I said doing. I don't think. That research ethics would prevent certain kinds of methods that do harm. I mean, offending people, I think, goes with the territory, presumably.
But would you count it as somebody teaching something like Holocaust denial?
The basic principle. I mean, this goes back to the question about the more general question about teaching. You teach. You exercise some academic freedom as a teacher, but you do it within a structure of where the field has got to. And given that Holocaust denial is so far outside of anywhere that any field is, that it wouldn't merit. It doesn't. I mean, one presumably in a university, I think you need even to John Stuart Mill said you should not hear all the opposing arguments because you need to constantly reaffirm the strength of the position that you hold. I think some of the more extreme things. I mean, the questions like should we teach whether evolution is false. I mean, some of those things are just too far beyond the pale. Gladly in this country, that they don't make it anywhere near that. But that was sort of going back to the more general point about the education. There are certain structures of where debates have got to, where knowledge has gone to, that it would be unreasonable to start challenging. So when I say, because I was against this sort of absolutism of freedom, just as my response to the Charlie Hebdo thing was that the sort of freedom fundamentalism comes out. Some people start thinking the word freedom means absolute lack of restraint. It doesn't. It means freedom. Academic freedom is freedom within the bounds of the activity which is academic, and that activity itself is very firmly structured. And things like logic and evidence count for something. And you can't just come and say any old thing off the top of your head and say that's my academic freedom, because that's not academic freedom. That's just being silly freedom. So, those extreme examples are outside of anything that would be regarded, in my view, as academic.
I think I'm more concerned about blurring the boundary between what is academic and what isn't. The first time I started talking about the kind of things I talked about today, I went to the internet, as one does these days, and about the first 500 pages I found about climate change were from climate change denial sites. And I'm struggling a little bit to know how, to know what to trust in a digital world. But I don't suppose that's any different from people writing books about Holocaust denial, or indeed evolution, which is an enormous issue in the US, of course.
I think that's also a very good question, because I'm thinking how one develops tricks and strategies for getting the information involved in the internet. But I think actually for people that don't have that experience and experience in looking at things critically, that's probably something we as an institution should be looking at much more. Because we've gone through a phase, and a few years ago people were telling students, oh, well, don't use the internet because it's all unreliable. And now you couldn't possibly function, I couldn't, without just relying on the internet for basic resources. But I think it's fair to say that probably we as an institution, we need to make sure, I guess that's already happening, that the students are equipped with that kind of those critical capacities, which perhaps isn't only about internet use, but it is also about critical thinking.
Well, there is a question as to whether academic freedom also applies to students, because looking at evidence of the University of Edinburgh's social responsibility credentials, it's very easy to see that academic freedom is afforded staff. It's part of the staff contract now. But I've been unable to find anything definitive on the question of whether academic freedom applies to students as yet.
So that just leaves me to say thank you to our panel and to you all for coming. So can we give everyone a round of applause?